In 1946, Mahatma Gandhi began a bizarre set of experiments with his grandniece Manu.
She sleeps naked with the Mahatma. Gandhi is naked too.
He would then ask her and himself whether the proximity or the touch led to any sexual feelings.
Gandhi was 77, his niece just 17.
Saints are not nice, conventional people. They are excessive, and he was excessive in that way in his struggle.
Behind these experiments lies the key to understanding the real Mahatma. Testing his celibacy was vital if Gandhi was to neutralize his sexuality and become, as he put it, God's eunuch.
I don't think Gandhi could have become the Mahatma if he did not have this problem with masculinity and especially male sexual desire.
This was part of Gandhi's lifelong struggle, using diet, dress and sexuality to make his body a political vehicle of non-violence.
He thought that if he actually could be that pure instrument, then, as though by magic, the world could be transformed. Gandhi really believed that.
Contrary to his iconic image of poverty and chastity, Mohandas Gandhi began life in a far more comfortable style. He was born in 1869 to a middle-class Hindu family in Porbandar, a small fishing port on the northwestern coast of India, where his father Karam Chand was chief administrator. As tradition then dictated, Gandhi was married at the age of 13, but the temptations of his new wife Kasturba would soon test the conscience of the adolescent husband. Only 3 years after the marriage, Gandhi's father became dangerously ill. As a dutiful son, Gandhi was supposed to spend each evening tending to him.
When he became critically ill, Gandhi would be by his bedside and would attend to him. And then, since his father had dozed off a little, because these were the last few moments of his life, Gandhi thought he could go away for a few minutes and rushed upstairs to where his newly married wife was.
But as Gandhi was making love to his 16-year-old wife, his father passed away. He was deeply traumatized by the event.
This shame of my carnal desire, even at the critical hour of my father's death, is a blot I have never been able to efface or forget. My mind was in the grip of lust.
He neglected his duty. He wasn't with his father when his father died. Now that's very important. Ask any Indian. The great desire would be, oh, let me be present when my parent is dying, so that I can comfort them. And this is the desire of every parent also, that one of their children should be with them. There is a sense of continuity. This is a deep mystery. I'm sure this is universal. He who was so dutiful, who had from an early age set himself the ideal of serving elders.
He had given way to his lust, to his accursed sexuality, and just then betrayed his father, the service to the father, because one must also understand he was a very dutiful son. So this incident is really where you see this overweening conscience in conflict with an overreaching sexual desire.
But there was to be a second terrible blow for Gandhi which added to his torment. His wife was pregnant at the time.
A few months later, when the child was born, the child didn't survive. And Gandhi immediately attributed this to the fact that the child was born out of his sense of guilt and that he had been punished for this, punished for double misdeeds. A, he had made love to his wife when she was pregnant, and B, he had left his father's bedside in order to be with his wife.
So sexuality to him curses all the generations, the father, the unborn son, and himself. So it's not just him, it lies really across the generations.
Just 2 years after these tragic events, Gandhi left India to study law in London. The conventional small-town life of Porbandar was soon left behind. He came into contact with new ideas and influences that would change his entire way of life.
He was not typically Indian in that he questioned many Indian things. Of course, he loved India, but he wanted to learn from all over the world, and he learned a great deal from his experience in Britain and in South Africa.
In London, Gandhi had explored many different spiritual and philosophical ideas, but it was not until he moved to South Africa in 1893 to work as a lawyer that he began to put them into practice. Central to Gandhi's ideas was a lifelong commitment to communal living. In South Africa and later in India, he set up several ashrams. Inspired by Tolstoy, who proposed a return to the simple life, these self-sufficient spiritual communities were meant to be models of a utopian society. As part of ashram life, Gandhi also developed a strict daily routine, which he hoped would help him attain spiritual purity.
He would get up in the morning at 4 o'clock. He would have his exercises. He would have his milk. He would have his diet, which was fixed and weighed so that not an ounce more, not an ounce less. Then he would do his daily work. Then he would have his massages, back to his walks. He would have his pedicures. He would have his manicures. That routine was religiously adhered to.
The desire to be a perfect instrument for God is very strong. He has certain goals of physical fitness, of moral fitness, of spiritual advance, and he knows that the body plays a part in this. So he's going to be championship fit.
In South Africa, Gandhi also began experimenting with fasting, a technique that he would use to great spiritual and political effect later in life.
Gandhi said that fasting produced a profound kind of inner peace in himself. And in that inner peace, there was a tremendous amount of intellectual clarity, moral clarity, which is why whenever, for example, he embarked upon great events in his life, political events in his life, launching a civil disobedience movement or whatever, it would always be preceded by a fast.
Gandhi set high standards of discipline for himself and his followers. He laid down strict ashram rules which everyone had to observe.
People were afraid of his discipline. They could not haggle about it. They knew that there is no two opinions, nobody will be spared, and even he was so particular about his own self, his wife, and his own family also.
For Gandhi's wife and his 4 sons, this meant, whether they liked it or not, they could no longer expect a special relationship with him.
He had to make this decision to, you might say, in a sense, renounce the family or the world. Not literally renouncing them, they stayed with him, but they became part of a larger family. To find that they were, along with hundreds of other people, they were all participants in some kind of great but unusual experiment, I'm sure was not easy for them at all.
Harilal, his eldest son, was shown no favours over the other boys in the ashram. When a London colleague offered his son a scholarship, Gandhi stuck to his principles.
Gandhi said to him, well, if 1 or 2 other youngsters in my ashram are as worthy or worthier of the scholarship, would you be willing to give the scholarship to them? So Dr. Mehta said, yes, I would. And in the event, Gandhi sent not his son, but somebody else. And I'm sure that this hurt Harilal very greatly.
For Kasturba, a traditional Hindu woman, this was not the conventional life she or her parents had envisaged when she was married to the eligible young Gandhi.
Very tough, very tough. Both the way she was treated, she had great hopes, for her sons and the kind of life they should have had, and they didn't have that kind of life. So, and Gandhi did recognize this. He wrote, I think, to one of his sons that you and your brothers and your mother have paid the price of my experiment. He was aware of that. But in a way, for him, there was no choice. If he was to be true to what he felt was his calling, there was no way in which he could lead a normal family life.
There was one final sacrifice Gandhi believed he and his wife had to make if he was to become a truly moral being: sex. He described the sexual act as a criminal waste of the vital fluid and an equally criminal waste of precious energy. In part, his conviction stemmed from the traditional belief, common to the world's major religions, that only a celibate could attain spiritual purity.
Well, it was almost a part of the Victorian way of looking at sexuality, that in the act of sexual intercourse, one lost semen and one lost physical energy. And that energy was fairly substantial, so the people thought at the time. So that one act of copulation would, for example, involve loss of energy equal to, let's say, 24 hours of concentrated intellectual work, or perhaps 48 to 72 hours of concentrated physical work.
Semen is the store of this high energy that if it is let out, then there is weakness, vitality is lost, but if it is stored in the body, then memory is improved, intelligence, vitality, all kind of good things happen to you.
And he thought, well, look, if this energy was not dissipated, then it could be used for other purposes. Now, in his case, there was the spiritual dimension, that rather than lose the energy, if it was sublimated, and it could be transformed into spiritual energy, a kind of spiritual vitality which regulated your body, then what initially was a physical substance became a powerful spiritual force which you could mobilize to transform other souls.
Gandhi had made several failed attempts to give up sex, but in 1906, at the age of 37, he finally announced to his wife that he was taking a lifelong vow of celibacy.
He knew the intensity of sexual love. And he would have known that this is going to turn his mind away from the goal of trying to serve everyone equally. But if he wanted to love everybody, he would have to renounce sexuality, because he knows from his own experience that it makes him love his wife and want his wife more than anything else in the world, and he has a bigger agenda for himself.
To Gandhi, not only was the sex act a waste of energy, crucially, he associated male desire with violence. He called it the serpent which I know will bite me. It was the start of his fight to drive masculinity out of his body.
He was very, very disturbed about his own sexuality, the male sexuality, the phallic desire. And that was a question which was to haunt him all his life. How to get rid of it or temper it or keep it down to become more like a woman.
Female sexuality for him was largely a way of seeking pleasure. Full stop. Or a dutiful discharge of womanly obligation. But male sexuality was very different because it was expansionist. Inevitably tinged with a sense of power, a sense of domination, a sense of conquest. And I think his struggle for non-violent resistance grows precisely out of this.
Gandhi often said that his celibacy was really the mainspring of his political actions, in the sense that his non-violence depended upon his celibacy.
Gandhi was now almost 40 years old and had reached a point where his physical, spiritual and political beliefs had finally merged into one philosophy, non-violence. He'd been practicing law in South Africa for 13 years. His early experiences of racism in the colony had quickly drawn him into the fight for the rights of the Indian community, and he'd already built up a reputation as a formidable opponent of the British Empire. So far, he'd operated through the courts, public meetings, and his own newspaper, Indian Opinion. But in 1907, within a year of giving up sex, he'd organised his first non-violent mass protest. This was just the beginning of a new style of politics that would shake the British Empire and write Gandhi into the history books as the father of non-violence.
I think the universal man, the Mahatma, as we see him, a political activist, sharpening the instruments of non-violent resistance, reaching out to other religions, organizing his family life, learning the technique of becoming a political figure, and all the maneuverings and manipulation that one has to do. So Gandhi, in those 21 years, perfected his moral, spiritual, and political profile.
Gandhi's victories against colonial rule in South Africa convinced him it was time to take the fight home. His new style of politics, rooted in his beliefs about his body, would soon create one of the most extraordinary independence movements the world had ever seen. In 1915, Mahatma Gandhi spent a year travelling India by train. It was part of a political campaign to find out how the poor of India were forced to live under British colonial rule. He travelled third class as a peasant and stayed in the homes of the poor. Gandhi had left India 20 years earlier as a young, privileged law student and now returned a 46-year-old seasoned political campaigner. In his time away, his body had become central to his political practice. Now, in India, he wanted to use it as a symbol to bring together the masses to overthrow the British Raj.
In order to change India, he wishes to lead India. And in order that he might lead India, he has to be a personality of the kind that India would respond to.
As he used to say, it's not enough to appeal to the head. You also need to appeal to the heart. And you appeal to the heart, the passion, the feeling, through symbols.
On his return home, Gandhi completely transformed his appearance. Though he was not a career politician, he instinctively understood the power of political image.
When he comes to India, the Western dress is left behind, which is his way of saying to his countrymen, I have returned a true Indian. So it's his way of conferring respectability on the poor Indian peasant, rebuking, very indirectly without saying so, the rich Indians who were walking around in all the fancy clothes.
But Gandhi wanted to make an even stronger political statement. In September 1921, he announced he would now wear nothing more than a loincloth. He planned to wear it for only 5 weeks, in a bid to promote his campaign to get India spinning and wearing its own cotton. The appearance of Gandhi, half naked at political meetings and rallies, shocked even his most loyal associates.
His closest colleagues were absolutely shaken, and they tried to persuade him to change the decision because this was very unusual. It wasn't as if every leading Indian figure emerged in this kind of clothing or lack of clothing. Rajaji, my mother's father, said to Gandhi that this just would not do. You're making a wrong decision. You should start wearing normal clothes.
The middle classes, the westernized Indians, were very suspicious of his new image. In fact, they considered that dangerous. A sizable and powerful section of India became hostile to him because they knew what were the tacit political message of those dress changes.
Despite the bewilderment of some of the middle classes, the poor understood the message of a bare-chested, humbly dressed Gandhi perfectly clearly. Women too were inspired by Gandhi's humility and explicit rejection of masculine traits.
in North India in those days, in the so-called affluent families, the women were not supposed to go out, so many of them have not seen the street outside their house. When Gandhi gave a call, fight for freedom, come out, these women just came out and joined the processions and went to jails, and they never asked permission of their husbands or in-laws or nothing of the kind. Gandhi's call was supreme for them.
Gandhi admired what he saw as women's passive strength. He wanted to develop feminine qualities in himself and said he'd like to become the mother of the nation. Women, he said, were his model for non-violent resistance.
Many congressmen were very, very uncomfortable with it because they thought he's going to emasculate men. He's going to make them less men, and, a freedom struggle against one of the mightiest empires in the world certainly couldn't be fought with these very feminine stratagems and feminine weapons. But the commitment to non-violence was not just a strategy or a tactic. It was an article of faith.
Gandhi's non-violent approach was difficult enough for traditional politicians to accept. Now the loincloth, the spinning wheel and his embrace of femininity seemed to tap in to an historic inferiority complex about Indian manhood.
From about 1880s onwards, a lot of prominent Indians reflecting on the plight of India and asking themselves a simple question. Here is a vibrant civilization, millions of people. How come the Brits, who invested so little in their imperial adventure, were able to colonize us? What's wrong with us? Then a lot of other people were saying it's extremely important that Indians should become physically strong. It's not enough to have willpower. You must also be physically strong, because the West represents physical power. And if you are going to stand up to it, you need physical power.
But Gandhi did believe in strength, he just didn't believe in violence. In fact, he called on India's youth to develop bodies of steel for the freedom struggle, and even inaugurated a number of gyms. In March 1930, he countered charges of emasculating the cause by fronting his biggest non-violent campaign with only men. It was called the Salt March, a protest against the British tax on salt. Men had to face the brunt of the British response, but react according to Gandhian precepts, passively, not aggressively. The protest was a huge success. It brought out thousands of supporters and gave the independence struggle worldwide publicity. Gandhi's achievements had established him as a key player. No one could deny his growing power on India's political stage, fueled in part by the extraordinary image he'd created for himself. His brilliance in mobilizing the masses, combined with his ability to operate within the political elite, had made him a real threat to the British Raj.
He not only used symbols, but became a symbol himself. A symbol of a proud, reflective, old India with a large civilization behind it, standing up to the West. That is what the sheer body, the figure of Gandhi symbolizes.
In August 1931, Gandhi sailed to Britain to take part in the Round Table Conference on India's future. He wanted to be certain the British too understood the political message behind his appearance. To make sure his solidarity with the poor was clearly understood, he stayed in the East End of London rather than a hotel.
Whatever the result of the mission that brought me to London, I know that I shall carry with me the pleasantest memories of my stay in the midst of the poor people of East London.
His extraordinary image shocked London society. When he visited the king, there was outrage at his lack of clothing. Gandhi responded by saying the king had on enough for both of us. Whilst Gandhi captured the public heart of England, politicians were suspicious of his common touch. Churchill famously described him as a seditious Middle Temple lawyer posing as a half-naked fakir.
Here was a person who was pursuing political goals and at the same time projected a certain larger moral and ethical concerns. Many of his contemporaries considered him to be a very wily politician. They felt that all his saintliness was a facade for his politics.
Gandhi's Christ-like image had made a huge impact in Britain, but brought no real political gains. The talks had been undermined by growing tensions between Muslims and Hindus in the Indian delegation, which Gandhi had been unable to resolve. He believed his political failure must be due to his lack of spiritual power. He returned home determined to redouble his efforts. In August 1931, Gandhi returned home from Britain empty-handed. The talks on independence had exposed serious religious divisions in the Indian delegation. Gandhi had been fighting for independence for 15 years, but he still believed he could unite India if he could change her people. He saw his ashrams as the starting point for that revolution.
His commitment was to a very difficult goal. He wanted to liberate India. He wanted the Hindus and Muslims to heal their centuries-old wounds. He wanted the caste Hindus to recognize how horribly the untouchables had been treated. He wanted to make India clean and sanitary. Can you believe it? He wanted to reach all these goals, and he sure made very tough demands on himself and on those people who were willing to be his colleagues and fellow fighters.
He wanted India littered with little saints all over. A very unrealistic expectation. And the ashram regimen was so strict, was so severe, that any average person would have a breakdown.
To those who said, yes, we will work with you to bring about these changes, Gandhi said, okay, I am the general of an army, a non-violent army, and will you obey these rules?
The most difficult ashram rule was celibacy, which Gandhi saw as the only true way to love your fellow man. For him, it was the key to political success. If the pure state of celibacy could be achieved, then Gandhi believed the divisions in India could be healed.
Gandhi went a step further by saying you should practice celibacy even when you are a married couple. And this particular vow was found to be difficult, and that's why it took them time to decide whether they were going to take the vow or not.
There are a lot of funny incidents whereby a young married couple would come to him and he'd bless them saying, may you have no children. An odd way of, giving good wishes to a newly married couple.
Even in his 60s, Gandhi often wrote about how difficult he found his vow of celibacy.
The sexual sense is the hardest to overcome in my case. It has been an incessant struggle. It is for me a miracle how I have survived it. It is like walking on the sword's edge.
Anxious to maintain perfect chastity, Gandhi experimented with different ways to dampen his libido.
To attain this celibacy, there are many ways, but for Gandhi, it was food which became the primary one. There are some foods which enhance your sexual drive, which should not be eaten at all. Onions, garlic, spices, chilies. Whether milk increases your sexuality, whether cow's milk does it, which he thought, but goat's milk doesn't. Now, only gourmands talk so much about food as he did. But they talk about food they eat. Gandhi talked about the food he didn't eat. So is that an obsession? In that sense, was he obsessed with sex? I would put it the same way. of the sex he did not have, the sex he did not want to have, obsessed with sex in that way, yes.
Gandhi's version of celibacy was surprising. Rather than removing himself from the presence of women, he surrounded himself with them.
That traditionally, religious people who have engaged in the experiments in celibacy or engaged in celibacy have avoided all kinds of contact with women. Whereas Gandhi would have women, very beautiful, attractive women in his ashram, in his communal living. He would put his hands on them and he would walk with them and he would stay with them. They would cook for him. He would make jokes with them. He would embrace them. He would hug them. So he wanted to live in the midst of women and not in the slightest be affected by the sexual impulse.
Gandhi tested himself and the women on the ashram to the limit, sharing the most personal aspects of his daily life with his closest female associates.
I hear that the inmates of the ashram have been complaining. Why does Sushila have her bath in the same bathroom when I'm lying in the bathtub? The suggestion was mine. While she's bathing, I keep my eyes tightly shut. What can be terrible is that she massages me while I'm lying naked. I have to be very alert while I bear with that massage.
Gandhi's focus on himself and his naive belief that women's sexuality was passive meant he failed to see the sexual tensions he was creating.
There was always this problem that the women would fall in love with him in some sense and want to become even closer. There were a lot of jealousies among ashram women of who he paid more attention to, who he paid less attention to, who he looked at more, who he talked more.
The word menagerie has been used by my father when he described the Sevagram ashram. And Gandhi, I think, liked practicing his non-violence with people of different temperaments, living together. And so that turned it into a menagerie which was much closer to a family than a zoo, I would say.
Living arrangements on the ashram tested even Gandhi's self-discipline to the limits. One of his closest associates was Madeline Slade, an English admiral's daughter who had travelled from England to join Gandhi's ashram in 1924 after reading a book about him. Gandhi admired her intelligence and dedication, renaming her Miraben after an Indian saint. She was utterly devoted to him. Their 24 years together were a trial of their self-discipline.
With Miraben, the involvement seems to be much, much more intense. So when she comes too near, he drives her away, but then immediately writes postcards that he's burning, how terrible it is for him. She's in his thoughts all the time. In both cases, the love is a sublimated one, and they both keep on telling each other, it is not personal, it is not personal. I think that they're protesting too much.
It was clear she was in love with him. She couldn't bear to be out of his sight, even for a day. But Gandhi insisted that she had to be away from him because he couldn't take the heat she generated.
No matter how intense, Gandhi refused to let personal feelings get in the way of his spiritual and political goals. In 1942, in a final attempt to unite his country against British rule, Gandhi launched the Quit India campaign. But now aged 73, his political power was fading, and with it his utopian vision of a united free India. He was immediately imprisoned in the Aga Khan's palace in Pune, where he remained for 2 years. As a wave of violent rioting spread across the country, he announced he was going on a 3-week fast in a bid to stop the bloodshed. The fast had little effect on the political situation, but it was taking its toll on Gandhi's frail body, which had now become a tragic symbol of his despair. To add to his sorrow, his beloved lifelong companion and secretary, Mahadev Desai, who had been imprisoned with him, had recently died of a massive heart attack.
Well, I was with him for the last 2 weeks of his 3-week-long fast. And this was the first time both my mother and myself were seeing Gandhi after my father's death. And my father died in the Aga Khan Palace. Physically, we could see he was weak. His voice became very feeble. We had to go very close to him. Even when we spoke, when my mother went and touched his feet, Gandhi just could utter one word, my father's name. He said, Mahadev. And after that, he could not speak at all. He broke down and there were tears flowing out.
3 months before Gandhi was released from jail in May 1944, Kasturba, his wife for 62 years, also died in the prison. Gandhi seemed to be losing everything. He believed his inability to change the course of events must be due to his own spiritual failure.
Mahatmas or the saints are supposed to be above any kind of human emotions. They're not supposed to be despairing anymore. There's this equanimity, the Buddha-like smile, that is what is supposed to be Mahatma. And Gandhi feels he has failed, that his non-violence has failed. Things which he has lived by have failed him. He is a very lonely, old, depressed man.
His response to this spiritual and political crisis was both predictable and extraordinary. He turned again to his body, but this time to test just how far he had succeeded in becoming God's eunuch. But this new experiment, far from improving his situation, would isolate him even further. By 1945, Indian independence was less than 2 years away, but religious tensions in the country meant the price for self-rule would be a separate Muslim state, Pakistan. Gandhi's vision of a united India now seemed out of step with a country eager for freedom. After 30 years leading the movement, Gandhi was now little more than a nationalist icon.
India wanted independence. India needed reconciliation. And the great dilemma for Gandhi was that the battle for independence which he led sometimes, often, made reconciliation even more difficult. The battle for independence sharpened divides within India.
In November 1946, Gandhi set off to walk through the villages of Noakhali in northern India, where brutal fighting had broken out between Muslims and Hindus. His efforts to bring the two communities together made him bitter enemies on both sides. As he walked through the rioting villages, Gandhi was verbally abused. Excrement and broken glass was strewn on the path in front of him.
He was barefoot in Noakhali, and his feet used to be lacerated and bleeding. He was barefoot because he felt that the thousands of men, women and children have died, and this earth and this soil is saturated with the blood of people, and therefore it is sacred. He was absolutely violated by the violence and the way people were butchered.
It shattered him. That the message that he had tried to give his country for 40 years hadn't sunk. That in his own country, he had not succeeded in proving the superiority of non-violence over violence.
No longer politically influential, Gandhi began questioning himself. He believed the celibacy he'd practiced for 40 years should have given him the spiritual power to change the world.
He has always believed that if he had this complete, absolutely perfect chastity, that his word would have almost magical potency, and the Hindu and Muslim division would be overcome, and India's imminent partition would be avoided. So he wants to test himself. Is there something wrong in him that allows all this violence? Is there something wrong in him that makes his voice feeble and weak and ineffective? So he has this idea of the celibacy experiment. He wants to test whether he he's absolutely pure in thought, word and deed.
In the past, Gandhi had slept next to female colleagues, but now, aged 77, he decided to put his celibacy to an even greater test. He began sleeping naked with his 17-year-old grandniece, Manu.
She sleeps naked with the Mahatma. Gandhi is naked too. And he asks her to write the thoughts, the feelings that she had. As she said once, she felt exactly the same as she would have if she had been sleeping with her mother. When Gandhi had succeeded in eliminating his own sexuality, but also the sexuality of the other person, that, he thought, showed the final climax, the triumph of his experiment in celibacy.
What Gandhi saw as triumph, others saw as scandal. Many people understood the virtue of celibacy, but they couldn't understand the virtue in sleeping naked with a young girl.
The very nature of the experiment provoked a great deal of controversy. He lost quite a few friends. A large number of people, Pandit Nehru, Sardar Patel, the great leaders of Indian independence movement, called on him, wanting clarification, and some even wanting him to stop this experiment.
Gandhi was unrepentant, but his efforts to explain the experiments in public caused more controversy.
In fact, there was one prayer meeting where he started to speak about it, and his translator refused to translate this particular part into Bengali. So these people who were close colleagues of Gandhi and co-workers with him, they became terribly concerned at this stage. And several of them withdrew their relationship from him at this stage.
Gandhi's family were also very uncomfortable with the experiments, fearing they would be too controversial.
The family was not very happy about it. People will not take it in a right sense. It is too difficult. They will unnecessarily will start talking about your bona fides and your character. But then he was a man of conviction. He was convinced and he did it.
Gandhi's answer was very simple. Look, A, I don't see anything improper in this. B, it's my life, and I have to live my life as my conscience dictates. Just because you have made me a Mahatma, don't expect me to conform to your standards of Mahatma. It's my life, and if my truth, as he used to call it, suggests that this is the way I have to travel, I shall travel that way, no matter what the world thinks of me.
For Gandhi, the experiments were a crucial part of his search for spiritual purity and salvation. Bowing to criticism would be a betrayal of his goals.
If I don't let Manu sleep with me, though I regard it as essential that she should, wouldn't that be a sign of weakness in me? And in that case, would not my death, since I would have failed to realize perfect non-violence, be the best thing for me?
Inevitably, the outside world took a less spiritual view of these experiments.
These experiments have been very much interpreted, and I think rightly so, as really a lonely old man seeking bodily warmth because he's alone. His own interpretation that he's testing his celibacy, well, is a bit flattering one.
Gandhi's celibacy experiment did nothing to bring Muslims and Hindus together. They simply marginalized him further. In August 1947, a partitioned India gained independence. As the country celebrated, Gandhi stayed home and fasted. Though Gandhi could still appeal to the heart of the nation, many now saw him as an obstacle to progress. When he embarked on fasts to the death to stop the continuing fight between Muslims and Hindus, even this drew some criticism.
People objected to this weapon of fasting They felt that there was an element of coercion in this, and was this really a non-violent thing to do, was to threaten that you would die unless people behaved the way you wanted them to behave. He accepted that there was something in this charge, but he said that this kind of coercion that you attribute to me is the coercion out of love. These people love me. If because of my fasting they change their ways, I see nothing wrong in it.
Gandhi's fasts stopped the immediate rioting, but he knew ultimately he'd failed to bring Muslims and Hindus together in a united India. His body had always been the medium for his message, and he believed there was one last way he could use it.
He felt that his life was now meaningful only if, through his death, it could contribute something to a change in Indian public consciousness. And he virtually invited assassination by saying that if I die on my bed, I shall be a false Mahatma. Only if I can die facing smilingly an assassin's bullet and take the name of Ram while I die, I will be a true ethical public figure.
Not only did he lose the will to live, but he acquired the will to die. That his will to live had not only weakened and sapped, but he positively seems to have been seeking for martyrdom, so that he could achieve in death what he had failed to achieve in life.
Gandhi was shot dead at a prayer meeting in Delhi on the 30th of January 1948. His assassin was a member of a right-wing militant Hindu group. Gandhi's desire to integrate Muslims was widely seen as hampering India's progress.
But they all felt that he had outlived his utility. It's almost like telling Gandhi, for the sake of India, that both you and we love, you must die. Because the kind of India that you want to bequeath to us is not the kind of India that will survive in the modern world. And it's very striking that when Gandhi's assassin, Nathuram Godse, when he finally kills Gandhi, he stands before him, bows to him in a traditional reverential Hindu way, calls him the father of the nation, and shoots him, almost with a sense of regret.
Gandhi's intense and sometimes flawed struggle to turn his body into a perfect instrument of God was over. His experiments had failed to transform the country he loved, but his Christ-like image and his message of non-violence were to endure as his indelible legacy to India and the world.